Hello, 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 everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Let's Talk About How's everybody feeling today? Feeling good? Just waiting now. People are signing on. So, hello, hello, everyone. I know I usually try and start super punctual. Okay, well, today we are continuing our exploration of sexual health topics this week. And today's topic is fluid bonding. Yay! All right, so just as a recap for those of us joining us for the very first time, Let's Talk About is a live podcast where we talk about sexuality and love, and intimacy, and relationships. And it's here to answer any and all questions that you have. You can type them into the chat or you can call in and get some advice in real time, including some one-to-one coaching if you want. So, who am I? My name is Tila. I'm a sex educator, relationship expert, and published author. I love sex ed. I've been doing it for a while now, and my mission is that everyone should feel as comfortable and awesome talking about sex because it's such a natural part of our lives. And people have lots of anxiety, and that just kind of it makes me sad. People should be able to connect with themselves on that level and enjoy the best sex that they can have and enjoy the best relationships that they can have. Okay, so without much further ado, just want to briefly cover our guidelines again. So like I said, everybody is welcome to comment and join in, and if you have thoughts or ideas, or maybe you want to share a story about something that we're talking about today, or maybe you want to ask a question about something that has nothing to do with what we're talking about, that's cool. You can call in, you can comment it. I try and respond to the comments as they come in, but a little tip for everyone else, we want to create a nice safe space for people to ask questions. The sad thing is that lots of people ask because they're afraid to look stupid and they're afraid what other people might think about them not knowing. And this is like a huge problem when it comes to sexuality and relationships. And so many people struggle because they're afraid to ask. So we want to create a nice, comfortable, safe environment where people feel comfortable asking questions, they feel supported, right? So if you're going to comment, please try and keep your comments positive. Don't be disparaging of anybody or give anybody a hard time for asking a question or commenting on a struggle that they're having. It's just going to discourage people, and we're really about helping people and creating a positive space. Okay, so that being said, hello, Amanda. Thanks for checking in. I love that you check in every day. I'm glad that you're good, although a little tired. I think it's a little bit the weather. It's really hot today. It kind of zapped my energy a little bit today, too. That being said, let's open up the phone line. So if you do want to call in with a question or comment or thought, the number, of course, is still the same. It's 1-877-777-5589. So feel free to call in with your comments, questions, thoughts, concerns. You want to correct me on something, you think I'm wrong about something, call in and talk to me about it. Love to talk to people about stuff. It's great. And please, also, everybody share this. Share this with somebody in your life. Lots of people don't know about sex ed. Lots of people struggle with, hi, Kat. Thanks for checking in and checking it out. But yeah, lots of people struggle with sex ed. Lots of people struggle with not knowing. You could be like, hey, I know somebody who's doing this really cool thing. Or, hey, I just found out about this sex educator and she's doing these live casts like 5 days a week. Come check it out. It's amazing. I learn all this crazy stuff. Share it. Sharing is caring. We want people to be able to get information, right? And of course, you can always check out previous live podcasts on my website, as well as Podbean and Spotify. Links are on my website. So before we get into today's topic of fluid bonding, I just want to quickly jump back to something I actually missed yesterday, and I got a question over email. The person preferred to remain anonymous, so I won't name them, but they asked about how I mentioned how it can take time for something to show up on an STI test. And I meant to mention what the windows were for each one, and I forgot. So thank you very much for emailing in that question. I'm going to briefly touch on that, and hopefully you're going to catch this live or catch the replay. So with chlamydia, it needs to be about 2 weeks from the chance of contact For gonorrhea, it is also 2 weeks. For genital herpes, it's usually 3 weeks. But typically, like we talked about yesterday, there's no test for that, so you're going to see an outbreak. HIV is about 3 weeks, and syphilis is 6 weeks, or it could show up in 3 months or 6 months. So if you're worried about being exposed, those are sort of the windows of how long you should wait before going to get tested, because it's not going to show up right away. Any questions about that? Any thoughts about that? Hi, Maureen. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so today's topic is fluid bonding. Who's heard of this? Have you guys ever heard of this term of fluid bonding? It is a safer sex method, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So it's a pretty simple but very important concept. And whether you heard about it or not, let's just start with a simple definition so everybody's starting on the same page. So fluid bonding is simply the agreement to share bodily fluids. So it's a very big consent piece. Now, this may not sound like a really big deal, and people are like, oh, well, I totally do that. So me and my partner, we have unprotected sex, so we're fluid bonded. Yeah, we got this covered. It's a little bit more than that because it's an important piece of consent, and it's actually a conversation that you and your partner have. So it's not like you just don't talk about it and have unprotected sex. I mean, technically speaking, at that point, you are fluid bonded, but you haven't talked about any of the rules. You haven't talked about, how you guys are going to handle things that come up. So it's an important conversation piece, and good communication is the foundation of great relationships. So, as with other types of sexual activity, of course, consent to fluid bonding is not like, oh, I'm going to consent to fluid bonding, and you're consenting to all the possible body fluids. It's a negotiation that each fluid is different, whether or not you're willing to kiss someone is dramatically different whether or not you're willing to have unprotected sex with someone, or whether or not you're comfortable if your blood comes in contact with their blood, or it could even cover things like urine or feces or scat or any of those things. So there's lots of different types of fluid, not just sexual fluids. So part of the whole thing about fluid bonding is having that conversation, knowing where your boundaries and where your limits are, what you're comfortable with, and at what point you're comfortable with things. Okay? So, yeah, covers fluid. Here covers any type of fluid, from saliva to sexual fluids to blood to urine to everything. So, as I mentioned, this is kind of a deliberate choice. It's a deliberate choice and conversation that happens between two people who are physically intimate. Does that make sense? Okay. So with that choice, it carries a pretty strong responsibility. When you fluid bond with someone, you're not only, placing your sexual health in their hands, but you're accepting the responsibility to a certain extent for the other person's sexual health, because now the choices that you make, now they're going to impact that other person, right? Because you're fluid bonded. That's part of the deal, right? So it's important that you're comfortable with giving that kind of trust to someone else, that it's the right stage for your relationship. We're going to talk about a little bit about that later on, but also that you're safeguarding your own health, right? So should you choose to fluid bond? That's a big thing that people always wonder, like, is it the right time? Is it the right thing for my relationship? Sounds pretty simple, but lots of people actually aren't comfortable about having that conversation around safer sex and what the boundaries are. Typically, people are not rehearsed in doing this, and that can make the conversation feel kind of awkward. I know I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention again. When things are awkward, that's not a terrible thing. Do not run from things that are inherent, or conversations that are inherently awkward, because they're awkward because we're not used to talking about them typically. So some things, like when you learn a new skill, no matter what it is, you always kind of feel awkward and silly the first time, or maybe you feel self-conscious the first time because it's new. It's something you're not used to doing. Don't let that scare you. Sometimes awkward is bad, but a lot of the times it's usually a sign of growth. So just keep that in mind. So if you're trying to decide if fluid bonding is right for you, then there's some things that you should sort of ask yourself. Like, what does this really mean to you? Why, like, do you do you have a good understanding of what it means and what the responsibilities is, and do you have a good understanding of what your partner expects from you? You know, why do you want to do this? Is it purely about physical sensation? Is it, does it have some sort of symbolism or meaning to you? Does it make the relationship feel more intimate? Like, what is the primary motivation that you want to do fluid bonding with someone? Because that sort of stuff is important. You should know why you want to do it, not just because, right? Another thing to think about is, how would you handle it if someone that you're fluid bonded with gets an STI? How are you going to respond to that, knowing that you've been exposed to that risk? And, what steps do you want to happen then? If somebody tests positive for an STI, what do you want the next steps to be? How do you want to be informed? How often do you want your partner to go get tested? How often are you going to get tested? Things like that is important things to think about. And, how you respond to these kind of questions is pretty key, and how your partner responds to these kind of questions. The other thing to think about too is, like, how might you feel if your partner decides that maybe they're not ready for fluid bonding, or maybe you guys have been engaging in unprotected sex, but now that you guys are having this conversation, there's stuff coming up for your partner, or maybe there's stuff coming up for you, and you want to take a step back and you want to use a different, safer sex method. How are you going to feel about that? How are you going to feel about having that conversation? How are you going to feel about your partner having that conversation with you? Okay? How you communicate with your partner, that you're not ready to do that. What are you going to say? Right? So having these kind of answers, or thinking about these kind of questions, is a good first step to sort of help yourself decide if fluid bonding, where you stand on it with this relationship. Okay? Now, remember, things may change over time. Maybe you're not ready now, maybe you're ready later, maybe you were ready before, but maybe something's changed. There's lots of different reasons why people choose to use fluid bonding as a safer sex method, or choose to use alternative safer sex methods. If you don't know how to answer any of those questions, or if you don't think you're comfortable talking to your partner about any of those things, it might be a good sign that maybe fluid bonding is not the right step for you right now. Okay? If we can't talk about the things that we're doing with the people we're doing them with, maybe there's something more going on there. Either you're not ready, or you're not feeling it, or you have some internal, like some personal work to do with your own comfort, with your own sexuality. So having sex is wonderful and great, but there's some responsibility there, right? So you have to make smart choices for yourself, and you have to make the right choices for yourself. Okay? Now, some people might think to themselves that fluid bonding doesn't really matter because they're in a monogamous relationship. And it sounds like something that maybe people who are in poly relationships, or maybe people engaging in BDSM scenarios with other people, maybe it's more of a conversation for them, and it's not really a conversation for people practicing monogamy. And I would disagree, mostly because you should be having these conversations. It doesn't matter what your relationship status is like. If you're, monogamous, if you're open, if you're in a poly relationship, none of that matters. What matters is that you're having those conversations about your health, and you're having those conversations about your boundaries and your limits. So, the other thing to know too with that is that, if you look at sexual health, most people who contract an STI, usually it's fairly common for people in monogamous relationships, I shouldn't say fairly common, but it happens that people cheat, unfortunately. And that's typically in a monogamous relationship, that's typically where an STI comes from, is an unfaithful partner. So having these conversations is important, because you're going to talk about those things ahead of time, right? I mean, you should never say, like, oh, well, if you cheat on me, or you're going to cheat on me, so we should talk about that. That's not a good way to start the conversation. But what I'm saying is you should have those conversations about safer sex and have those conversations about barriers and limits and what can change things. Because when you have those, you're sort of practicing with your partner, and your partner's practicing too. And people who practice this conversation are going to feel less awkward about it. They're going to feel more comfortable having the conversation. And if the unfortunate circumstances happen that someone cheats, they're also more likely to actually have that conversation with the person they're stepping out with, which means they're also more likely to engage in safer sex and less likely to bring an STI home. So I know this isn't the most pleasant thing to talk about or to think about, and we would hope that if we make a commitment to someone, that they are just as committed to us as we are to them. Unfortunately, the reality is that sometimes these things happen, and we don't want to be caught off guard. We want to know where we stand. We want to be able to know how we're going to react, how we're going to address the situation as best as we can. I mean, things always happen unpredictably. There's no way to account for that, hence unpredictable. However, when we set those limits for ourselves, it makes it a lot easier. We tend to feel a lot less blindsided because we've given it some thought, right? Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts that they want to share about any of that? Or story? I mean, you may not want to tell a story about a unfaithful partner, but I don't know if that makes sense to everybody. I mean, another great thing about talking about fluid bonding, whether or not you're going to do it, is it can be really big empowerment piece for some people, because you're able to clearly communicate with someone what your own comfort level is and what your preferences for different types of sexual activities are and what safer sex methods should be used for you to feel comfortable, right? You're taking charge of your own sexuality. And that's one of the reasons I actually really love talking about safer sex. And I love it when people talk about safer sex, because it's like you were empowered with your own sexuality. And that's great. You know, that's a good first step to having fulfilling sex and relationships, right? If that makes sense, which I hope it does to everybody listening. So, as with negotiating consent and in other areas, you know, you and your partner should discuss what limitations there are. And if there's any circumstances for, you know, these rules to be bent or broken, you know, like saliva, for example, is a really easy one. You know, some couples they consider themselves monogamous, but they're not really concerned if their partner makes out with someone. You know, so in what circumstances is that okay? Is it okay? And if it is, what circumstances make it okay? At what point is it not okay? You know, should you find out if this person that they're going to make out with has a cold sore or gets cold sores? You know, like where are those lines going to be drawn? And most people don't think about this. So if this is hitting you all in a new way, that's okay. It's cool. Just take a nice deep breath. You don't have to make any decisions right now. But you can just start rolling around, start thinking about it, you know. You know, you should also know what types of bodily fluids are going to be included in your fluid bonding. You know, typically the defaults are things like saliva and sex fluids. But once again, you know, as we sort of talked about a little bit earlier, you know, where do you stand on blood? Where do you stand on urine? Where do you stand on vomit? I know that's kind of an uncomfortable thing to talk about, and people are like, why are we talking about vomit in sex conversations? Is that some sort of weird fetish? The answer is yes, it is, but that's not what I'm talking about specifically. What if you live with your partner and you have a very strong reaction to someone vomiting? Like some people can be triggered to vomit by the smell of it or by seeing someone else vomiting. So if that's something for you, like if that just happens, you know, that may be something you want to talk to your partner about. Like, hey, cool, you know, I'm cool with taking care of you when you're sick. I'm cool with doing all this stuff. But if you're vomiting, that's where I draw the line, because it impacts me. I can't handle it, you know. So some of this stuff is not always sexual, but it might be a good thing to know in a relationship. You know, if your partner, somebody's like, oh, when I have the flu, you have, you know, I'm one of those people, I need to be like weighted on hand and foot to feel loved and to feel cared for. And if I'm vomiting, you need to hold my hair back. And you're like, oh my God, if I can't do that, you know, like that's That's something you should talk about before it happens. Not because it's sexual, but because it's good to know. And it's about that trust piece. It's about that communication piece. You know, setting limits, setting healthy boundaries, letting your partner know what those are. All key parts in communication. Anybody have any thoughts about that or questions so far? I know I'm kind of going through it pretty fast today, and this is a really new concept for a lot of people, so I want to make sure that we're taking the time to get those questions in if you guys have them. And, you know, like I said, as we started off this broadcast with a question that was emailed in, you can always catch up the questions at another point if you think about something later. Or we're actually going to do a nice big question period tomorrow. So questions of anything from this week, or any questions at all, as always. Always open for questions, okay? Still pretty quiet, so I'm going to keep on then. So now that we've sort of talked about, you know, what fluids are included, what rules can be bent or broken, you know, an important thing to remember too is that when you're talking about this as a safer sex option, fluid bonding does not really, like, aside from the obvious, like, rules that you set, it doesn't actually protect you from STIs. If somebody has an STI, you're going to pass it. Like, there's, you know, if you're not using barriers, you're going to pass it. So that's important to know. And the other thing too is that fluid bonding in the situations where people have cause to worry about it will not protect you from unwanted pregnancies. So if avoiding pregnancy is something else that you and your partner are discussing, then you might want to think about a different safer sex method. This may not be the option for you, or you might want to combine it with another safer sex method such as birth control or some other option. We're going to talk about those kind of options on another week. I thought about trying to get into sexual health, but there was just too much this week, so we'll give that its own time. Yeah, so you want to think about those sort of things, right? Like when you're just trying to decide, is this the right method for you and your partner? Okay. And the other thing too is that you want to talk about, depending on what kind of lifestyle you have, whether you're choosing to be monogamous or open, or if you're going to play parties or sex parties or swingers or whatever you're doing, that's cool. But you need to figure out what sort of testing schedule, you know, that you and your partner feel comfortable with for the types of activities that you're engaging in. So, you know, we talked about testing yesterday. I'm not going to rehash all that. You guys can just listen to the live recording from yesterday to, you know, get recommendations on testing. But you should be talking about what kind of testing schedule, and that should really be determined by what kind of activities you guys are choosing and what sort of lifestyle you're deciding to lead. Okay? If that makes sense. Okay, so we sort of touched on this a little bit already, but I was going to talk about why fluid bonding can be so important, but I think I've sort of covered that throughout, but we'll just do a little recap. So, you know, regardless of what kind of relationship you have, you should feel comfortable in communicating stuff like this with somebody you're having sex with, regardless of what kind of relationship. Doesn't matter, makes no difference. Another reason why this is important to you, and like I said, most of the STIs and unwanted pregnancies that happen in monogamous relationships happen because somebody cheated. So gaining some comfort and establishing those boundaries with this type of conversation. You can also talk about what sort of safer sex supplies you're going to keep around. Many people, because they never acquired that comfort around the safer sex conversation, and if they are a cheater, they never carry safer sex supplies because that can make it look like they're intending to cheat. So it's kind of a weird thing, but I mean, the stuff you want to sort of talk about, do you want your partner to be open and honest with you about what's happening, or do you want them to go around your back, right? So how you have these conversations is going to make a big deal, or make a big difference. And it can also make a big difference in the choices you make. If somebody's likely to cheat on you, do you really want to fluid bond with this person? If you're concerned that cheating is a significant issue, you know, that should play over into other choices that you make just to protect yourself. I mean, if you're comfortable with the level of risk, you're comfortable with the level of risk. But the point is that you have to make that choice, right? And you should be informed about it. So Fluid bonding should not be a default for any relationship. It doesn't matter what kind you have. Okay? It should not be a default because communication is important. And I know a lot of people, particularly monogamous people, will tend to just sort of slip into it, and they'll just all of a sudden, after a certain amount of time, stop using safer sex barriers and just sort of just start having unprotected sex, but they never have that conversation. And I highly encourage the conversation. The good communication just builds stronger and better and more fulfilling relationships. And when you have that communication and dialogue established with your partner, when you do run into trouble areas, it's going to be a lot easier. Why? Because you've already established that you can talk to each other about things that might be difficult. Okay, so it's about flexing those skills. All right, we learn all kinds of skills, and we practice all kinds of skills for other areas of our life. We should be doing with our relationships too. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes, no, maybe. Am I totally off whack? And you're like, wow, this person's crazy. What is she talking about? Hopefully not. Communication is great. You should have it. You deserve it. You deserve good communication in your relationship. You deserve great relationships. You deserve it. But that doesn't mean you have to work for it. A little bit. Just a little. Okay? It's kind of that how much effort you put in, it's what you get out of it. One of those kind of deals. So, a common criticism of fluid bonding, and something that people, or like, some people feel very strongly that fluid bonding is not something that should be taught, that it's something that people should just stop doing because of some of the issues it presents. So a really common misconception is that fluid bonding is just more romantic and trusting. That relationships that have fluid bonding automatically must be awesome, because otherwise why would they do it, right? There are a lot of really valid reasons why people would choose a variety of different safer sex methods other than fluid bonding. There's like so many, So a relationship should not be judged on whether or not they are fluid bonding. You should not judge how intimate your relationship is by whether or not you have unprotected sex. That's not a measure of a good relationship. Lots of bad relationships have unprotected sex too. This is not a good measure, okay? So it's important to know that. It's important to address your feelings about that. Fluid bonding does not mean more intimacy, okay? There's plenty of situations where it can mean more intimacy when the proper steps are taken and the relationship's really solid, that communication is really good. But there's also a lot of situations where fluid bonding is not because of intimacy and trust. It's because of lack of communication. Sometimes it's because of a lack of trust. There's lots of different nuances to relationships, okay? So something to keep in mind is that it doesn't necessarily mean more intimacy, all right? And once again, really driving it home, like, fluid bonding is not a final once and for all, okay? Like consent, it is reversible, not in the sense that you can take it back, but you can stop doing it going forward. You don't have to. Once you're fluid bonded with someone, you're fluid bonded as long as you're having unprotected sex with them, okay? As long as you are still responsible and they're still responsible for your health, as long as it impacts each other, you're fluid bonded. Okay? If you break up with somebody and you're not exposing yourself in that way to them, or you're not making yourself intimate in that way with them anymore, it's not an expectation that you should, right? So it's important to remember that there's some people choose to start doing fluid bonding and maybe decide for a variety of reasons that maybe it's not for them. Maybe it's not the right move for them. And I mean, like I said, there's lots of legitimate reasons for this. First one that sort of comes to mind is urinary tract infections, for example. So women or people with vulvas will know this one, but many men or people with penises, not necessarily as much, because they don't always have the same experience or some people don't always talk about what's happening. So, but what can happen for people with vulvas is that they can get bladder infections after having unprotected sex where they don't pee afterwards. And this is why, you know, peeing after sex, good thing, very healthy, please do it. However, sometimes you don't pee fast enough, sometimes you can't pee, things happen, sometimes you fell asleep, whatever. But the point is that the reason this happens is that, and the reason the recommendation that you should pee after sex comes because the body treats sperm like a foreign invader, which kind of is, you know. But what'll happen is that the body will have an immune response and try and attack and kill the sperm. And sometimes the body tries to do this a little too hard. And the results can lead to a urinary tract infection. So this can range too. Pardon me, so I'm just going to have a little bit of water here. It's very hot in my place today. Whew. Anyway, so this can range too because everybody's biochemistry is different and unique, right? So somebody who has a reaction or a strong reaction to somebody's sperm may not have the same reaction as someone else's sperm. So there's lots of couples who choose not to do fluid bonding because of persistent urinary tract infections, you know, regardless of how often they pee after sex or how soon they pee after sex. It just happens. It's frustrating, it's painful, causes lots of doctor visits with lots of antibiotics, which are not great to be taking for extended periods of time. So there's one example that came off the top of my head for why people may start fluid bonding and then maybe decide, you know what, maybe this isn't a great option. Maybe we need to use barriers. So I don't know if somebody else has another example that they want to throw out, just throwing it out there. If you guys have a story, something similar, or another reason that, you know, feel free to chime in. You guys are super quiet today. Maybe it's a subject matter, I guess. Not a lot of people know about fluid bonding. That's cool. It's a learning day. We're having a learning day. But yeah, so that's one example. Some people also don't like fluid bonding as well because they feel like it's a rejection or like an automatic loss of intimacy. And, you know, if someone is feeling that way, I think there's a really important conversation that should happen there. You know, what is causing those feelings? Why are you feeling that using a condom is a step back in terms of intimacy? You know, where are those feelings coming from? What's causing that? And more importantly too, like, how can that be addressed? How are we going to resolve that feeling? Because if somebody decides that fluid bonding isn't right and they want to go back to condoms or barriers, for example, I mean, that choice has to be respected. You know, we have to respect people's choices over their bodies, regardless of what kind of relationship we have with them. It's important. It's consent, very important. So, you know, if someone is having that kind of reaction where it feels like a rejection, I think that conversation needs to happen there. Because if it doesn't, what can end up happening is it can sort of, hurt feelings have a way of festering when they're ignored. You know, they tend to bubble up. They turn into resentment. Resentment can manifest in anger. And anger is never, ever good in a long-term relationship, or really in any relationship. Anger is a very important emotion. It helps us identify when something doesn't feel right for us. When something isn't right, we tend to be angry. That's how we respond. And that is a clue for us. And I don't think we have enough conversations about anger as a society and what it really means, you know, and how to deal with it. But we should be having those conversations, especially in our romantic relationships, ideally. I mean, obviously there's always exceptions. Some people do have long-term anger issues or struggles, but that's sort of a whole other conversation not really relevant to fluid bonding. Maybe we'll talk about that a different day, but not today. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? Maybe something you were hoping I was going to cover about fluid bonding that I haven't quite gone over yet. How's everybody feeling? Feeling okay? Yeah, you guys are pretty quiet. Have you guys heard about fluid bonding before? Is this something you've come across? Like I said, I know it's not as talked about as much. It's more talked about in poly and BDSM relationships historically. Although I've noticed in the last couple of years that a lot more sex educators have been talking about fluid bonding, which I think is good and kind of interesting, despite what some people feel isn't good about it. But I'm always on the opinion that good communication is always going to be better than no communication. If communication is something that is ruining something, a relationship, a situation, then it probably just wasn't the appropriate communication, because good communication tends to make things better. We feel less angry about things. We're able to cope with things when we understand what's happening. When we don't understand what's happening, we can get irrational, we can get angry, we can get hurt, frustrated, sad, but if somebody explains why something is happening and we can understand the reason behind it, typically all of a sudden, we feel a lot more settled with things, right? That's why I'm still a big advocate of talking about fluid bonding, even if it's not right for you, even if you think that, well, I'm in a monogamous relationship and I don't really need to talk about it. You still should, even if it's for that like vomit reason where, hey, I don't want to hold back your hair while you're vomiting. Thanks, Amanda. I'm glad to know that you're taking it all in. Thank you for commenting. I know it is a lot to take in if you've never heard the term before, or if you're not familiar with it. It can be kind of a novel concept, which is why I was trying not to rush too much through it, because it can bring up a lot of different stuff for people, and people don't always know what to make of it, and they're not sure about their feelings about it. And if you're feeling it that way, that's totally natural. Like I said, you don't have to make any decisions right now. You don't have to make any choices right now. The important part is that you're getting the information, that you're spending a little bit of time to think about it, and then in the future that you're sort of adding that as a conversation piece in the relationships that you're having. How am I going to deal with this going forward? How do I feel comfortable communicating about this? What do I need to feel comfortable to communicate about it? Right? Awesome. Well, that was actually kind of what I wanted to chat about today when it comes to fluid bonding. I don't know if anybody has any questions. We'll just give it a little bit longer just in case people do have a few questions about fluid bonding or anything I've said, or anything else at all. Like I said, we don't always have to talk about what the topic for the day is. If you're logging on for the first time and you're like, hey, what is this? Sex educator, here to answer your questions, help you out with your stuff that, you need answers to. Or conversely, if you have a great story you want to share about, something awesome that you're doing, or some like relationship success that you've had that you're like really proud of, or you just want to share to inspire others, please call that in. It's all about sharing ideas. The conversations that we have about sex and sexuality continue to evolve over time because we're talking about them. I mean, look at the conversations, how the conversation has changed with consent ever since the Me Too movement. Huge change in conversations. We talk about stuff now that we never talked about before. And it's also easier to talk about it now. Why? Because more people are having the conversation. More people are coming up with scenarios and voicing things that have happened that we never thought about before, But it was always there. We just never talked about it. So, when we're isolated, we're not as strong. Together, we are amazing. 2 heads are better than 1. 5 heads are better than 2. So on and so on and so on and so on, right? It's all about creating that community and having that support and learning and expanding your boundaries and, you know, sharing this with people that you know and having those conversations, getting people engaged in conversations. That's what it's all about. Okay? Exploring new ideas. It's part of the reason I love talking about sex so much. There's so much to explore in terms of what people are doing and how they're doing it, and you know what sort of things did I never think about. You know, as an educator, I'm always learning, always learning. I never stop learning about sex, and even though I feel like I know a lot, I know that I only know a portion. There's so much more. You know, even if it's just like cultural differences and so on and so forth, right? Okay, well, I guess you guys have had lots of time to ask any more questions, so I guess we'll move into our final thoughts for the day. So, of course, the next episode will be the last episode for this week, concluding our week on sexual health as it relates to STIs anyway. And so tomorrow we will be live again on YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook at 8 p.m. Pacific Time, 11 p.m. Eastern. And we will be talking about living with disease tomorrow. So if somebody has contracted or tested positive for an STI that we don't have a cure for, what does that look like? What should they think about? What should they know about, right? And of course, we're going to have that question and answer period. So if you have questions of anything that's come up this week that you're like, man, I wish I had asked that when we were talking about testing, or I wish I had asked that when we were talking about fluid bonding, hey, cool, ask it tomorrow, or email it in and I'll address it on the air if you're not going to be able to make the show. Okay? And once again, please share, share, share. Sharing is caring, and we want everybody to have as much fun and to have the best relationships they can. If you're looking for extra resources, extra information, extra articles, games, fun stuff, please check out my website, exploresextalk.com. There is so much stuff on there. I think I have like over 300 articles and games and stuff on basically anything and everything relating to sexuality, and I'm publishing new stuff all the time, and a bunch of it is there for free and accessible. If you're looking for a little bit extra more, I do have a paid membership portal, which is Sexy Hero Society, and that is $20 a month and gives you extra content like sex positions and relationship challenges and erotica slams and coloring pages and adult cartoons and 50 billion other things that I basically, like, new content is published that at least once, maybe twice a week. So it's well worth it, and the proceeds go to furthering sex ed. So support it, share it, love it, and I will see you guys all tomorrow. Okay? Have a great night, everybody.